Thank you to Roy's YouTube community. We asked you all some questions, or we asked you to give us some questions about the current situation, the conflict between Israel and Iran. Today is, what is today? June 24th. So for some context, the U.S. recently had an airstrike in Iran, and they retaliated on an airbase in Qatar, and now there is a ceasefire that has within the past 12, 24 hours. So given that context, Roy is going to answer some of the questions you gave us. Thank you for all the questions. We had over 200 responses, and so these are some of the ones that we've boiled down to ask Roy. Hello, Roy.
Hi, how's it going?
Good.
Good to see you, Jeremy. Been a
Um,
while.
it's good to see you, Roy. Yes, it has been. All right, are you ready for the first question?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, first question. We're going to start with some historical foundations. We have a couple questions from this category. How have U.S.-Iran relations evolved since the 1953 CIA-backed coup, and how do those events still shape current tensions today?
Okay, well, that's a foundational question. So, uh, in the British Empire's imagination, Iran was supposed to end up inside the British Empire, at least part of it. Um, what they realized was that they didn't really have the tools to conquer Iran. They didn't have the resources. They were too spread out. There's enough that they had conquered India. So they came up with an idea that they would co-conquer Iran with the Russians, and it ended up in Sykes-Picot, which was the plan to divide up the Middle East between France and Great Britain. France and Great Britain made the plan. They were going to include Greece and Italy and Russia, but they didn't ever ask those countries for their opinion. They were just being thrown in. Um, and then the Russians had the Communist Revolution, and the Soviet Union told them there was no possibility they would do this. But that's after the Russians did actually invade Iran in 1909, and the British and the Russians worked together to overthrow Iran's first attempt at a democracy, which was created in 1906. And they successfully tanked that democracy. So in 1950, Iran created its second attempt at a democracy. And in 1953, the United States CIA conducted a coup d'etat and overthrew Iran's second democracy. So its two democracies were killed. Um, when the second democracy was put down, the British had it in their mind that the United States would do the coup, but then Iran would end up in Britain's sphere of influence. And the United States had a different plan, which was that Iran would end up in the United States' sphere of influence. And in the period from 1953 to 1979, Iran and the United States became extremely close, uh, to the point where the United States actually headquartered its CIA operations for Asia in Tehran, and that included, because the CIA needed to be able to print money quickly, that included mint plates to make uh, $5 and $20 bills, and it included a lot of data like where the spies in China were. Um, and then, the United States also sold Iran F-14 Tomcats. Only two countries on the planet have ever owned F-14s. It's the United States and Iran. And so we ended up with this really close relationship to the point where there were jokes being made that would go things like Iran is the shopping mall of the Middle East, or Iran is the little United States. Gugush, the singer, uh, if you like pop music and you wanted to hear something that was kind of culturally more or less recent in Iran, Gugush is the person. She's amazing, amazing artist. Her album that she put out in the 1970s has her wearing a cowboy hat with bleached blonde hair, and she's holding two pistols. And like this is where they had gotten to. Um, Iran had really sort of taken on this idea that it was westernizing and it was modernizing, but it wasn't ready to give up its cultural past. So it was holding on to a lot of that legacy, its poetry, looking at the Hachemenishi Empire and glorifying that and trying to put those symbol sets up. And so when the Islamic Revolution happened in 1979 and it all came crashing down, it was the United States acted like a scorned lover. The United States took this extremely personally. Now, obviously, the Iranians also made it personal. It wasn't like they were making it personal. The Iranian leadership was calling the United States the Great Satan. People were in the streets chanting Magna, America, which means death to America. Uh, the American flag was painted on the side of a building and it ended in bombs and skulls. And, there was a lot of really intense anti-American feeling. But I think psychologically, the damage on the other side of the Atlantic was that we felt like we had been scorned, like we were rejected after this really intense relationship. And it was just pendulum swing. There was a population of people who felt that Iran had just gone too far and had rejected too much of its culture and too much of its religion. And when that happens, you're going to get a wild and painful pendulum swing, and that's exactly what happened. The Shah, during the 25 plus years between 53 and 79, the Shah was a tyrant. He wasn't the worst tyrant the world has ever seen by any means, but he did not allow true freedom of press or true freedom of speech. He didn't allow for any real political rivalry. Right up until the end, Jimmy Carter put a lot of pressure on him to start to liberalize. But it was too late. It was too late to liberalize at that point. He should have been doing that years earlier, transitioning, especially because the clock on his life was running out. And he leaves the country to go get medical treatment, and that's when the revolution happens in his absence. In many ways, it's a lot like the Soviet Union. Gorbachev is doing perestroika and glasnost and trying to bring the country into a more liberal stance right before it implodes, and the Soviet Union dies anyway. Reforms are great, but you don't want to do them too late. You want to do them in time to actually have them save your state. So that period of time switches over to the revolutionary period, where Iran completely ends up rejecting the United States. And we were in a really nasty kind of Cold War status with Iran. Reagan became president, and he encouraged Iraq to attack Iran. The United States actually did militarily not only back the Iraqis, but the United States on multiple occasions bombed Iranian facilities, and definitely played a very active role against Iran. Ironically enough, Oliver North was selling Iran spare parts for its U.S. equipment, including the F-14 Top Shot, at 4 times market value. So we're giving Iraq all this equipment and then selling Iran spare parts for its equipment. And then, interestingly enough, in the Clinton administration, there was a thawing out, and it was because of the Iranian president. His name was Khatami. And Khatami wanted to liberalize Iran. He wanted to put in a bunch of reforms. As president, he had very limited power, but because he had the backing of the people, because the people really wanted this, he was successfully getting some of those reforms through. And he began secret negotiations with the United States that became a little bit more public as time went by. And the United States' number one demands was, we want to start seeing U.S. products being sold in your country. And the Iranians were like, okay. I mean, we thought we would be talking about other things, but your first priority is Coca-Cola needs to be drunk by our people, so we'll accommodate that. And then 9/11. And when 9/11 happened, Iran immediately put out a condemnation and then said that Iran was willing to do anything to help the United States. And at that point, the United States took Iran up on that offer. Iran had been backing the rebels who were fighting the Taliban in Afghanistan. And we basically said we want to have contact with those rebels because we're going to help use them to fight the Taliban. And Iran went, yeah, absolutely. An enemy of an enemy is a friend. We'll help you out. And the Iranians thought that was it between the cooling off period, or I should say the thawing off period that was taking place in the Clinton administration, and then Iran helping the United States in Afghanistan. I think huge portion of the Iranian government thought this is it. We're going to be friends. We're going to figure this out. And then in 2002, just a few months later, George Bush Jr. got up and he gave his State of the Union speech. And he said there is an axis of evil. And he said it's Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. And that was it. The hardliners in Iran were empowered. They pushed back against the reformers. And the rhetoric went back to there's no way to make peace with the United States. There's no future for that. And we've been on that path really ever since. There have been, attempts here and there to sort of fix things, but nothing serious. 2015, we got the JCPOA, and then Trump tore it up in 2018. So any attempts at sort of bringing Iran back into the world scene, the Clinton administration and then the Obama administration were destroyed by the subsequent Republican president that came in.
This next one is basically a follow-up. You covered it by answering that first one, but I'll state it in its entirety, and you could address it how you want. Has the long history of Western intervention, including regime change, been driven more by political or economic motives?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the answer is yes. And the reason I'm saying that is because there are definitely times when it's obvious the United States is acting for political reasons, and there are times when the United States is acting for economic reasons. And there's a pattern too, like a geographical pattern to this. So, for example, in Central America, when the United States would go in 100, 120 years ago and overthrow Nicaragua's government, or overthrow Honduras's government, or overthrow Guatemala's government, they were very clearly interested in the price of bananas, literally the price of bananas. And so that's where the term banana republic comes from. We would go in, overthrow the existing state, and then bring in a puppet who's going to lower the price of bananas. So clearly that was an economic motive. And a lot of what we were doing in East Asia, our interventions in China and Korea, for example, in the same time period, 100, 120 years ago, those were clearly very economically oriented policy choices. But then there are moments when we are clearly acting out in a way that looks like it's more ideological. And in the case of Iran, I think that's a clear example of it. That if we really cared about the economics of this, we would have followed through with the integration of Iran back into the global system that Khatami was trying to pull off. If Khatami had been successful, and he could have only been successful if the United States gave him the economic ability, right? If Iranians saw their wealth increasing, it would have given him the kind of backing he needed. Because you got to remember, by the Iranian constitution, the president of Iran isn't the guy in charge. The supreme leader is, hence his name, supreme leader, right? And it's the Ayatollah Khamenei. There have only been two. The other one is Khomeini. The current one is Khamenei. I swear they did that just to mess up Americans. You constantly hear people go, and then Khomeini. And no, dude, that guy died a long time ago. It's time to update. But so there are these times when the United States clearly sacrifices economics because there's something else at stake. Our blind support of Israel is another classic example of that. If we really cared about the economics of this, we would have definitely abandoned Israel a long time ago. We lose so many opportunities to do business in the Middle East because of this. And then, what we did in Vietnam was another classic example of it. There are moments when we clearly aren't operating on by economic motives.
Yeah, interesting. So I think the political motives there, because we see this now in U.S. politics, is that the political motives of just the public opinion to stay in power for the votes far outweigh any other reason. A lot of times it just leads right back to personal economic motives. But yeah,
Yeah.
we'll go on to the next question.
Well,
This is just me talking.
no, but it's an important point that you bring up, which is one of the problems with electoral republics is that the politicians have to somehow motivate their voters to go to the voting booth. And that's not always easy. So it'd be great if you had some kind of emotional issue and, having a villain that you can point to and say, that guy, they're bad, we hate them, is a great way to motivate voters. It turns out the two emotions voters are most responsive to are hatred and fear. So if you can fill people with fear and hatred, you can get them out there to vote. By the way, the worst emotion you can get them with is disgust. So that's a thin line of hatred, fear, and disgust, right? You need to, if you're trying to manipulate people, you got to get it right. And there are some really amazing masters at this. The unfortunate thing is what you're literally doing is you're dividing your own population and pitting it off against itself in the process. And eventually that will result in a civil war, right? I mean, it's just inevitable that at some point you'll have crossed the line.
Are we going to go to next topic of more U.S.-centric, U.S. power, policy, and influence? The question is, why has the U.S. shifted from covert regime change to open declarations of such intentions?
Yeah, that is a fascinating thing. So, in the aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union, um, the U.S. reevaluated the way it was going to approach international politics. And of course, most of that was actually done under Bill Clinton. And one of the things that Bill Clinton decided to do was start defunding the State Department and increasing military funding. So he literally shifted our emphasis from diplomacy to war. This is one of Clinton's many mistakes, but he sort of ruined our approach to diplomacy by doing this. One of the things you have to remember is there was kind of a code amongst most of the leaders the United States had produced in the 20th century. 20th century, like after Roosevelt, after the second Roosevelt. So forget Harding and Coolidge and Taft, those guys, but Wilson maybe you could include in this, and even Theodore Roosevelt you could include in this. And then everybody after Franklin. And what the understanding was that we were going to at least pretend that we were the good guys. We were going to hold ourselves to, we were going to hold the world to a set of standards that we would never reach, right? But we were going to pretend that we had reached it and we were the beacon of hope for humanity. And that was the approach, and that meant that we needed to operate in a way where the president was sort of, above politics. The president looked out for the best interests of the world and the country, right? We were at least pretending that those things were true even when they weren't. Reagan and Nixon kind of started to break that a little bit, but even they were holding on to it to a degree. George Bush Sr. is kind of the last of that way of thinking. And let me just give you an example of what I mean. So when the Berlin Wall fell down, there was a moment there where the U.S. could have made a really big mistake. And the difference between the big mistake and not making the big mistake was who was president. If it had been Reagan or Clinton or George Bush Jr. or Trump, I'm pretty sure we would have made the big mistake. But because it happened to be George Bush Sr., maybe Obama would have done the right thing, I'm not sure. But George Bush Sr. did it. His response to the Berlin Wall coming down was to do nothing. And when you think about it, this is the perfect opportunity for a Reagan or a Clinton to jump on an airplane, fly to Berlin, dance on the wall, and thumb their noses at the Soviets and say, look, your stupid wall came down, and mock them. Instead, by Bush not doing that, by Bush not taking the opportunity to go rub salt in the wound of the Soviets, he left the door open to have a good conversation with Gorbachev, and then subsequently with Boris Yeltsin. And we actually ended up, because of Bush's actions, with 10 years of peace with the Russians. The Cold War really was lifted, and from 1990 to 2000, we really had a good relationship with Russia. It was incredible, to the point where George Bush Sr. went to Gorbachev and said, look, Germany is going to reunify. That's a done deal. Germany is a NATO member. That means that East Germany is going to end up being in NATO. What do I have to do to make you happy? Right? Today, a president like Trump isn't going to ask a question like that. He's going to say, too bad for you, go to hell, and that'd be the end of it. And instead, he and Gorbachev had a conversation. And they came up, by the way, with a deal. And by the way, the deal was that NATO would not expand east of East Germany. And of course, a few years later, it totally began expanding east of East Germany. Was it 99 when Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, I think, joined NATO in 99. I'm probably wrong about my year, but we immediately began expanding eastward, at least under the Clinton administration, even though George Bush Sr. had promised Gorbachev that would not happen. The reason I'm saying all this is because that was a style of presidency that Clinton began the process of jettisoning. Although, again, Reagan and Nixon had actually started that even before Clinton. So that by the time we got to George Bush Jr., which was right, literally, it went George Bush Sr., Clinton, George Bush Jr. Like, we're only talking 2 presidents later. He's openly, actively talking about overthrowing governments in the Middle East, one after the other. Right, taking out the Taliban, taking out Saddam Hussein. When they were talking about taking out Saddam Hussein, they actually came up with a list of countries they were going to invade and conquer. And there were 2 different lists that were being circulated. One list was that it would go, the first thing to do was Iraq, then Syria, then Lebanon. And then I think they wanted to do, I think this is the order, after Lebanon, Libya, then Sudan, and then they would end with Iran. And they were gonna change everybody's flags, and they were gonna send Christian missionaries to these countries to try and Christianize them, and they were gonna send in the IMF and the World Bank, and they were going to completely redo these countries, right? They would all have white and light blue stripes on their flags, and they were going to be redone in the United States' image. That was the goal. The other plan was they would invade Iraq, and then they would either do Iran or Syria next. And then after that, they were going to go for Saudi Arabia, and then finally they're going to end with Egypt. And both of these plans were based on the idea that there was nothing that the Middle East could do to stop this from happening. And of course, what ended up happening was Iraq and Afghanistan just humiliated the United States and stopped them cold in our tracks. And, here we are, and the Middle East is in much worse shape than it was when we found it. So, beginning with George Bush Jr., there was just no even pretending that we were about letting people have the right to self-determination. There was that had all been jettisoned. And instead of us relying on the State Department to go in there with soft power and try and convince people, the whole idea was we were going to go in there with military power and overwhelm. But the real origins of this, of course, was the CIA running around overthrowing democracies. And literally waging terrorist campaigns to try and convince voters to vote one way or the other. And so, yeah, it was a long time in the making, basically. But
you should do a talk just on the unchecked operations of the CIA for a while.
Yeah, I mean, if I were the king of the United States, I would just delete the CIA. I don't see what purpose they serve.
Okay, they were kind of their own sovereign entity for a long time.
They really were, and they really are.
Taxpayer dollars.
Yeah, well, they were created by a group of men that went to the government and said, "Do you want us, and we'll let you fund us, or we just go do it on our own. And the government went, okay, we'll fund you. Like, this is not okay. That's what we decided. We decided we wanted to have a wing of chaos creation that would assassinate people and overthrow democracies. But you know what's crazy is they suck at predicting anything. They didn't predict the fall of the Soviet Union. They didn't predict the breakup of Yugoslavia. They didn't predict the fall of Bashar al-Assad's government. Like they have never actually served us any other purpose than being a chaos sowing entity, other than corporate espionage. They do successfully spy on other people's companies and steal their secrets.
This is an interesting question. It kind of gets into the hypocrisy of our American ideology or US's ideological background for some of our actions. The question is, how do American leaders and media reconcile promoting human rights while backing governments that violate international law?
Yeah, this is one of those interesting things. Okay, so it's not hard to come up with a list of the governments that violate international law, war crimes, crimes against humanity that the United States backs. But you have to also remember the United States has actually never been the beacon of goodness that it pretends to be. I mean, it wasn't that long ago when the United States still had slavery, and it wasn't that long ago when the United States was, oh, well, the United States is still actively committing genocide against Native Americans. So we have our own human rights violations that we regularly do with the Native American population. With unarmed black people in the way that police deal with them. What we're doing now to immigrants, we are clearly in that zone where we're the human rights violator. So at some level, us interacting with human rights violators isn't really hypocrisy. The hypocrisy is the way we're portrayed. The way we're portrayed in movies, the way we're portrayed in the news, as, we're the good guy, hoorah, rah, we stand for human rights. Ironically, in many ways, countries that we villainized frequently actually did a better job of standing for human rights than we. I think the average American in their mind thinks, what we're doing is wrong, but it's what we need to do for the greater good. Like, if I commit enough evil, there will be goodness created in the world. And I think that's how they reconcile it in their heads.
The ends justify the means.
The ends justify the means. And I disagree with that.
It never ends. That's just that endless justification cycle of doing horrible things.
Yeah, and one of the things we do too is we oversimplify things. Like, for example, I think in our mindset, monarchy is bad and democracy is good. But there are plenty of monarchies in the world that are working great, and they produce fantastic outcomes. And there are republics in the world that aren't working great, are not producing fantastic outcomes. And I think that's also a problem, that we've made this too ideological. Like, if you're a capitalist and you're a democracy, you're automatically good. And that isn't necessarily the case. So I think there's an oversimplification on the part of the public. And there's also this deal with the devil attitude.
Here it's going on to another question, which is kind of an interesting dichotomy. It's a really good question, I think. Why is Israel allowed to possess nuclear weapons while Iran faces intense opposition for even pursuing enrichment?
Yeah, so one of the interesting things is, if you look back at when Israel really started thinking about getting nuclear weapons, the United States was against it and resisted Israel getting the nuclear weapon. Israel's response to that was to break into the Oak Ridge, Tennessee plant and literally steal material out of it and bring it to Israel. And then, of course, Israel began working with apartheid South Africa. And apartheid South Africa had access to plenty of uranium. Israel had the know-how. They didn't have the material. And they said to the South Africans, look, we'll help you build nukes if you give us the material. And they struck a deal. I think it was in 1979. I could be wrong with about my year. It was during the Carter administration. But somebody mysteriously detonated a nuclear bomb in the South Atlantic. And then I want to say the next year there was another 2 or 3 detonations. And, Jimmy Carter's response was to do nothing. But it was very clear to everybody on the planet that it was an apartheid South Africa, Israel test. These were tests. They were just making sure that the nukes that were being made worked. And it's very probable that the Israelis had the nukes, maybe as much as 10 years prior, but they just didn't have, they hadn't tested them yet. So 79, I think, is the test year. And in a way that was all on purpose. The Israelis wanted the world to know they had the nukes, but didn't want to detonate them in their own territory because they didn't want anybody able to prove that they had them. And in that way, it could be a threat that they could use against potential rivals. Like, look, we have the nuke. We will use it. You need to back off. At the end of the day, the answer is the United States Security Council vote. The United States, the Security Council has, I don't know how many votes at this point, pointing out every time Israel has done a crime against humanity, and then the United States steps in and says no, and vetoes it. The United States allows Israel to literally break every law ever created, including by us, international conduct. For example, it was one of the defenses during the Nuremberg trials that the Nazis were using, that they did a preemptive war against first Poland and then later the Soviet Union because they believed that Poland and the Soviet Union posed a direct threat to Germany and Germany's security, and they were just trying to eliminate that threat. And we were like, guilty, and we put a noose around their neck and broke their necks and killed them. And declared that a preemptive war was a crime against humanity. Or a war crime. Sorry, it's a war crime. Well, what do you call what Israel does on a daily basis when they're attacking Gaza, when they're attacking Syria, when they're attacking Lebanon, or now they're attacking Iran? Those are all preemptive strikes that the United States itself said was a war crime, and yet here we are. And the world really doesn't seem to be interested in doing anything about it. One of the things that comes up from time to time is, why aren't the Arabs doing something about it? Well, there was a war in 48. There was a war in 56. There was a war in 67. There was a war in 73. Then the Israelis invaded Lebanon in 78 and withdrew, and then they invaded in 82 and stayed until 2000. And the answer is that the Palestinians are Arabs, and they're stuck in a perpetual war now. Since 1948. And the problem isn't that the Arabs aren't fighting the Israelis. The problem is that there's no way to win as long as the United States backs Israel. And that was proven in 1973. In the first 2 days of the 1973 war, Egypt beat the crap out of the Israeli military, and the United States intervened and saved Israel and put Israel into a position where it could do a counteroffensive and militarily win the 73 war. It was like cheating at that point. And President Sadat got up in front of the world and said, we proved we can beat Israel, but nobody can beat the United States. And I think that was the moment when the Arab world just went, okay, we're going to have to endure this. There is no way out of this. The United States is going to let Israel just do whatever it wants to. And then how do you disarm a nuclear power anyway? Do you invade it? It's going to drop nukes. That's the whole idea. I mean, that's the lesson North Korea has taught the world. If you have the nuke, you will be left alone.
So is that the reason you think that Iran pursuing nuclear enrichment has been so opposed by everyone? Because Israel, it sounds like they just kind of snuck it in and did it, and they're like, no, now that you have them, we're not going to mess with it.
Yeah.
But since Iran doesn't have it yet, we want you to not have it.
Yeah, I mean, that's 100%. We don't want Iran to get the nuke because at that point we can't invade it. Right? There's no military option going forward. Israel won't be able to terrorize it and bomb it. Having said that, all the intelligence reports that I've seen anyway, including those issued by Tulsi Gabbard, a member of the Trump administration, have said that basically since 2015, Iran has been playing by the rules of the JCPOA, even though Trump tore it up in 2018. And so in reality, Iran is not acting actively pursuing the creation of the nuke, at least according to the intelligence reports that are out there. So, I know every year Netanyahu says Iran is within 2 months of making a nuke, and he's been saying that, since 2012, I believe. So we're now 13 years of Iran being within 2 months of making the nuke. If they had the nuke, I don't think Israel would have attacked. I don't think that was on the table. And I think right now the Iranian government is going, okay, lesson learned. We were playing, by the rules for 10 years, even though this treaty that we had signed got unilaterally torn up. I bet you they're going to do everything they can to get the nuke as fast as they can, including maybe cheating and buying it, like just buying one from North Korea or something.
Why wouldn't they?
Oh, I would. I would do everything I could to get it now. Lesson learned is what I would see this as. And for that matter, you're Saudi Arabia, if you're Turkey, if you're Germany, you're Japan, South Korea, Indonesia. I think everybody should be scrambling to get a hold of a nuke at this point.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, there's no law, right? There's no international law. It's just a bunch of rogue countries, including the United States. Look what the United States did to Iraq and Afghanistan. What was that?
Yeah. As soon as you have the capability, then you have more say.
Yeah, yes.
You have more control.
Yeah.
Because people aren't going to. It's not worth the risk.
It's not worth the risk. I mean, look at how many times India and Pakistan have been on the brink of breaking out in a war, and I think every time they're like, oh wait, we can't fight each other anymore. Okay, fine, let's stop.
All right, so let's dig back into the current situation. These are more theoretical, looking into the future of what's currently going on. So the topic is escalation risks and tactical scenarios. First question is, what is the worst case scenario for the U.S. in this conflict?
Okay, I've been thinking about this. So the worst case scenario is that Iran feels like it's backed into a corner and there's no way out. And what'll happen at that point, I believe, I could be wrong, but I think that's what the attack in Qatar was a signal for. Right? We're going to attack a military base. We're probably not going to kill anybody. We're probably not going to do any major damage. But we're going to do this, and we're going to do this in Qatar. Qatar is, at worst, it's a neutral state. At best, it's actually leaning pro-Iran. It has a friendly relationship with Iran. And Qatar has served the United States as a negotiator. Qatar is our primary negotiator with Hamas and the Taliban, for example. So for Iran to attack Qatar was really fascinating. It's sending a signal. And here's the signal I heard. I could be wrong, but this is what I heard. If you guys keep escalating and you back us into a corner, we're not going to just shut down the Straits of Hormuz. We're going to start sinking oil tankers. We're going to start targeting not just military bases, but we're going to target oil facilities. And we're not going to care what country those oil facilities are in. And we're going to have our Houthis shut down Bab el-Mandeb and keep launching missiles at all the ships in the Red Sea. And we're going to go for breaking the global economy. That's the message I heard. And at that point, then, what's the United States' response going to be? We will look like idiots and fools if we don't strike back. And as a result, what are we going to keep launching missiles at them? They're going to keep launching missiles at us. At some point, we'll have to put boots on the ground. Iran is 90 plus million people. Afghanistan today is 40 million. When we invaded, it wasn't. I think it was 30 million. So we couldn't defeat a country 1/3 the size of Iran. And we were there 20 years. And we were so shamed and humiliated. The government we had put in fell before we even withdrew. So we have no chance against Iran if we put boots on the ground. They know it. And I think that's the big danger, is that we'll get sucked into another war that the United States can't win. And with Trump at the helm, you could totally see how that could happen. It could go worse than that. And the worst scenario would be that Russia and China got involved directly. I don't think that's on the table because I think Russia and China would rather watch the United States get stuck in another war they can't win and watch from the sidelines as they pump weapons and money into Iran. But World War III is definitely on the table. If we do,
Okay, so that's the next question. So
okay,
is this conflict laying the groundwork for a third world war?
it is possible. I think it's unlikely. And the reason I think it's unlikely is because I think the Russians and the Chinese don't want one. Like, there's nothing in it for them. Having said that, I could see a mistake happening. And here's the scenario where the mistake happens. Uh, the United States does get too heavily involved in a war with Iran, and China goes, oh, now's our chance to grab Taiwan. And China goes to grab Taiwan, and Trump throws down and says no. And the next thing you know, we're in a shooting war with the Chinese in Taiwan. So I think that's the flashpoint, is that there will be a miscalculation on the part of China over Taiwan because they'll think that Trump has either signaled by accident that he doesn't care about Taiwan, because he keeps doing that, right? He keeps saying, I don't care about our allies, I'm not interested in defending them. And then they'll make this mistake, or they'll go for Taiwan, and Trump will be like, I don't care, and he'll let it happen, and Taiwan goes, beep, and that's it, because they can't defend themselves without us. So um, at that point, of course, if you're South Korea and you're Japan, and for that matter, Vietnam and the Philippines and Indonesia, you're in panic mode because you're thinking, oh my God, who's next? I think that's the big fear in Europe as well, right? Who's next in Putin's line? Now, fortunately for Europe, Ukraine has held its ground, and Putin hasn't been able to win the war. And as far as Europe's concerned, as long as Putin is stuck fighting Ukraine, he's not fighting in Poland, right? He's not expanding the war. So this isn't actually a defeat for Europe at this point. It's not great, but right, these are the types of situations though that can easily end up in an accident, and they spiral out of control.
So this next question you touched on when you were talking about Iran being backed into a corner and disrupting the global economy. So the question is, can you explain how a global war might affect food supply chains and everyday civilian life?
All right. Yeah, that's a huge question. We look what the Houthis managed to do just by launching a few missiles last year into the Red Sea, right? All that shipping that was going to the Suez Canal got turned around and sent around Africa, and it caused serious delays, especially in Europe, shortages in stores. And then even a few years earlier, that ship that went sideways in the Suez Canal and blocked it, and it caused massive disruption. Just a simple ship accident can have this kind of an impact. So the answer is, if we do a large-scale global war, it will have a catastrophic effect on trade and shipping in a time where our planet is completely intertwined. So, the grapes that you're eating in winter are probably grown in Chile, and you're probably eating shrimp that was grown in Brunei, and you're eating salmon that was raised in Norway. And all of a sudden, those trade lines get disrupted. Like, how do we compensate for that? Obviously, we can give up the grapes from Chile, but the protein that we're getting from Norway and Brunei might be harder to replace. And we're gonna be in a world of hurt. If we ended up in World War III, I think everybody would stop before it got to nuclear. Just for the record, I don't think it has to end in a nuclear war. In fact, I think 99% it won't. What will happen is the side that's losing will threaten a nuclear war, and then everybody will go to negotiating tables. What I think will happen though is, if the war is fought for 2 years, we'll probably see 100 million people die a year from starvation. Because the destruction to the global economic system will not just take food off the table, it'll take money out of people's wallets, and I don't know how people will feed themselves. And so the war will be a mass starvation event more than a combat-triggered loss event. And that's the scary thing about World War II. The joke I'm trying to tell to make it funny is, if World War III happens, there'll be two types of people. People who know the taste of human flesh, and dinner.
I didn't expect that second one.
Yeah.
We have one more question, and it's about a reaction from the Iranian people. Um, what is the likelihood that Iranians will rise up against their government in this moment, or instead rally around their flag?
So we've seen Iranians basically rise up multiple times. The, the Amini uh, uprising that took place just a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, and then the 2009 Green Movement, Mahsa Amini, I forgot her first name, the Mahsa Amini uprising, and then the 2009 Green Movement. But even before that, right, and was it Khatami elected in 98? I think it was 97, 98. You know, Iranians have been trying to either reform or topple their government. And they've had really courageous attempts at this. Um, my experience looking at history is that when you start bombing a country, those types of reforms go by really fast. I mean, the classic example of this was Germany in World War II. So up until 1943, one third, one out of every three Germans was actively resisting the Nazis. They were doing things like keeping their children from joining the Hitler Youth. They were sabotaging equipment. One of the really interesting things is with all the German quality stuff that we think about and talk about, they were having trouble with their ammunition being unreliable because the fuses were often shorted, and so their shells wouldn't go off because Germans were literally sabotaging them. But by about 1943, the U.S. bombing campaign had flipped that around, and Germans began to think, "Oh my God, we're all going to die if we don't win." And they began to rally around the state, even though they disagreed with it, because they began to see it as, "Oh my God, we have to survive this. How do we survive this? They're blowing our cities up." And I think that's what, if this, obviously there's a ceasefire right now, but it's already been violated, but maybe it'll hold. Who knows? If the ceasefire holds, maybe 12 days of exchanging fire back and forth won't have an effect. I think if the ceasefire falls apart and they return to shooting at each other, I think we'll start to see Iranian people rally around the flag and reform goes out the window. Um, the only possible way that doesn't happen is if the Iranian economy collapses and people are literally starving to death. Then maybe you'll see, a revolution. But what'll probably happen is Khamenei will jump on an airplane and fly to Moscow or Beijing and hang out with Bashar al-Assad. And, you know, uh, I don't think he's going to get dragged through the streets. So, and then at that point, what is the IRGC going to do? Who knows? But bombing a country has not historically helped reform movements or revolutions.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's a bunch of Iranians right now, Iranians in the diaspora, Iranians in Iran, thinking this is the end of the Islamic Republic, and I think they're going to be really sad. I don't see it.
Yeah, well, I mean, we'll see. There's been a lot of surprises
Yeah, and
recently.
that's the thing. History has gotten a little bit unpredictable, and it's entirely possible this will bring down the Islamic Republic, and we'll sink kumbaya and have a great time. I mean, look what happened to the Bashar al-Assad regime. It went down so quickly, and nobody saw it coming. Nobody predicted it. So even the guys who did it were thinking they were 9 months away, and it turned out they were 9 days away. And you're like, wait, what happened?
Well, thank you, Roy, for hanging out, and thank you for answering questions from your community. I know a lot of people are going to be really grateful
Well, thanks
for
for doing
this.
this with me, Jeremy.